Greetings, everybody. Welcome to another Berean Bible study. Happy to be with you tonight. And it's tonight where I am, whenever you may be watching. It could be morning, noon, or night, but I'm glad we're able to get together again around the Word of God. And we were just speaking offline. I am hoping that my internet connection will hold up. I'm out of town right now from my regular spot, but I'm trusting, hoping, and praying that we will get through okay. But all being said, God is good, and we thank Him for the privilege of gathering together again around His Word. So let's pray, and then we will jump right into it. We will be turning to Exodus chapter 18. That's where we will begin tonight. So let's get ready to enjoy another time in the presence of the Lord. And Lord, we thank you for your goodness. We thank you for another day in your presence. We thank you for another day that you've made in which we rejoice and are glad. We pray that you will be glorified in everything we say and do today, and that you truly will bless us as we immerse ourselves in your word. We pray that you will teach us, that we will learn, and that we will grow, that we will understand, and then that we will be able to share your word with others. And for these blessings, we give you thanks in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. I'll be with you this week. Next week, Pastor Adrian will be leading our lesson. I will remind you of that again. Hopefully I'll remember at the end of this session. But as always, thank you for your company as we go through the Word of God together, continuing in our Bible Basics series. As always, we have a lot to cover. And as you have no doubt begun to realize, it's like every chapter has another incredible event taking place. And we just want to dive in and see what we can glean from this tonight. Exodus chapter 18. Jethro, the priest of Midian, Moses' father-in-law, heard of all that God had done for Moses and for Israel, his people, how the Lord had brought Israel out of Egypt. Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, took Moses' wife Zipporah after he had sent her away, and her two sons, of whom one was named Gershom, for Moses said, I have been a sojourner in a foreign land. The other was named Eleazar, for he said, the God of my father was my help and delivered me from the sword of Pharaoh. So as you recall from earlier readings in Exodus, Moses had come back with his wife, and at least one son was mentioned who had not been circumcised, and we had that whole situation of this child almost having been killed because Moses had not circumcised him and included him in the covenant of Israel. So now we just get another little piece of information that in fact he had sent them back home to say, you know what, I don't know what's going to be going on here. This probably is not the best place for you, and actually sent them back to his father-in-law. So now Jethro, his father-in-law, in verse 5, came with his sons and his wife to Moses in the wilderness where he had camped. So now everybody's back together. And Moses, verse 8, Moses told his father-in-law all that the Lord had done and all of the hardships that had befallen them on the journey and how the Lord delivered them. And then down in verse 17, Jethro has looked around and observed what's going on. And Moses' father-in-law said to him, the thing that you are doing is not good. Actually, I should back up to verse 13, came about the next day that Moses sat to judge the people, and the people stood about Moses from the morning until the evening. Now, when Moses' father-in-law saw all that he was doing for the people, he said, "What is this that you are doing for this people? Why do you alone sit as judge, and all the people stand about you from morning till the evening?" And then his father-in-law said in verse 17, "This isn't good. You'll wear yourself out. The task is too heavy." Verse 19, "Listen to me. I will give you counsel, and God be with you. You be the people's representative before God, and you bring the disputes to God. And then teach them the statutes and the laws, and make known to them the way in which they are to walk and the work they are to do. Furthermore, you shall select out of all the people able men who fear God, men of truth, those who hate dishonest gain, and you shall place these over them as leaders of thousands, of hundreds, of fifties, and of tens." And he just went on to say, they'll handle all the day-to-day stuff, and you handle the major disputes. Verse 24, "So Moses listened to his father-in-law and did all that he had said." And Moses put all of this in place. And then Moses in 27 bade his father-in-law farewell, and he went his way into his own land. So the big thing here is Moses now setting up this council of elders as his father-in-law had advised him, and this now became a way in which he could get some rest and not have the complete burden of judging the people on his shoulders 24/7. So that's chapter 18. And so if there are any thoughts or questions, whatever, please jump in. And Brother James, you just let me know, please.
Brother Dean?
Yes, with regard to Jethro, Jethro would not be an Israelite. Is that not so?
That's right. He was from Midian. He was a Midianite.
So he kind of parachutes in, and next thing you know, he's like running the whole place.
Oh, well, he's Moses' father-in-law. He is a priest of Midian, so he has certainly some knowledge of leadership, some religious background. But as his father-in-law, he certainly had Moses' ear. And remember, he had lived with him for 40 years. So he did have clout as far as Moses was concerned.
But he's not really part of the tribe of Israel, whom he's judging.
No, he isn't judging them. He's judging Moses. He's
he's making a case to be the judge.
No. He is telling Moses how to get help for himself, to help Moses in judging. But no, he said what he had to say and went back home. So he certainly wasn't trying to set something up for himself. He was just trying to help out his son-in-law to make his life easier.
In that case, my error.
Yeah, no problem. All right. Now we get to chapter 19, and we have another timestamp here in 19:1. In the third month, Moses, in the third month after Israel had left Egypt, they are now in the wilderness of Sinai. So we've seen, a number of things transpire from the time that
You're muted, Pastor.
I'm not quite sure what I hit and why I did that, but I apologize. I hope you can hear me again now.
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. So, yes, I was just mentioning that we're only 90 days into the journey of Israel out of Egypt, and now they're at Sinai. And verse 3, 19:3, Moses went up to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain, saying, "Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob, and tell the sons of Israel, you yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now then, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be my own possession among all the peoples, for all the earth is mine. And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." So this now is the start of another amazing interaction between God and the children of Israel. So, verse 7, Moses called the people, the elders together, and told them what the Lord said. And all the people, in verse 8, answered together, "All the Lord has spoken, we will do." And Moses brought back the words of the people to the Lord. So now we have this, very strong middleman uh, thing going, as already has been the case, but now intensified a little bit, and you have Moses starting to use his elders to disseminate the word to the people. Verse 9, the Lord said to Moses, "I will come to you in a thick cloud, so that the people may hear when I speak with you, and may also believe in you forever." And Moses told the words of the people to the Lord. And let's not pass over verse 9 too quickly, but just to make the point that the Lord said, "I'm going to speak to these people, and I'm going to speak in an audible voice that they can hear." And if you read, because in this study we won't uh, take a long time, as you can see, on any particular chapter or scenario, but if you get into Deuteronomy, you will see how many times it is listed that God spoke to the people in an audible voice. And so if you go to Deuteronomy 4, you will see Deuteronomy 4 verse 10, "Assemble the people to me, that I may let them hear my words." Deuteronomy 4 and 12, "The Lord spoke to you." And later on in that verse, "You heard the sound of words." Verse 13, "So he declared to you his covenant." Verse 15, "The Lord spoke to you at Horeb." Verse 33, "Has any people heard the voice of God speaking from the midst of the fire?" Verse 36, "Out of the heavens he let you hear his voice." Later on in the verse, "And you heard his words." Chapter 5, verse 4. This is Deuteronomy 5 and 4. "The Lord spoke to you face to face." Verse 22, "The Lord spoke to all your assembly." Verse 23, "You heard his voice." Verse 24, "We have heard his voice." Later on, same verse 24, "God speaks with man." Verse 25, "If we hear the voice of the Lord our God any longer, we will die." Verse 26, "For though who is there of all flesh who has heard the voice of the living God?" So 15 times in those couple of chapters, it mentions this phenomenon that took place 15 times. So although the Lord just sort of passed over it here, it was clearly an amazing situation that the people literally heard the voice of God speaking to them. And then continuing on in Exodus chapter 19, Moses told the people how to consecrate themselves, how to prepare for this visitation of God to speak his word to his people. And verse 19, when the sound of the trumpet grew louder, and again, please, I know you've probably read ahead and have gone through this, but if not, please make sure to read these chapters verse by verse to get all of this in, because I am just moving quickly along. But in verse 19, Exodus 19:19, it says, when the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder, Moses spoke, and God answered him with thunder. And some of you will have in your margins a little notation to say that thunder is also translated a voice or a sound. And so this now in chapter 19 is the preparation of God to come to speak to these people. They consecrated themselves. Of course, there was this whole situation throughout the chapter that there were boundaries set. The people and the animals could only go so far, and the presence of the Lord in verse 18, the mountain was just all covered in smoke or a thick cloud, and there was a fire that appeared on top of the mountain, and the smoke of this fire ascended like the smoke of a furnace. There was an earthquake, all this in 1918, and so the people were somewhat scared, and God came down in an awesome display of power to speak to his people. All right, so that is chapter 19. So any thoughts there? And Brother James, again, please help me.
Brother
Brother
Dean?
Dean?
Just in terms of some of the language that's used, Pastor, 1919, NIV is going as far as saying it's a ram's horn and not a trumpet. And I suppose that really doesn't make a difference, but there is a lot of different language being used between the two versions that I've noticed quite a bit, actually. Like instead of saying death, it said consumed by fire. And so I think there's a lot of room for interpretation in the early parts of both well, certainly Exodus and maybe Genesis as well. Like interpretation, not saying anything is wrong. It's just the viewpoint may be quite different from, like you said, many hands that may have actually conceived this.
Yeah. So if you go back up to verse 13, it does identify when the ram's horn sounds a long blast, they shall come up to the mountain, and so. Verse 19, it's just using another word there, when the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder. But certainly, I know when we hear trumpet, I think, the concept of a modern trumpet comes to mind. But verse 13, it may in your version also, as it does in mine, specify a ram's horn. So that's what they referred to as a trumpet at that time. So loud noise from a loud instrument, and certainly caught their attention. And then God began to speak. Are we good, Brother James?
Yes, we are.
All right. So now we get to chapter 20, and One of the things I'd like to mention, just as we are about to start with chapter 20, is comes to us from 19:5, that if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant. And so one of the things that has often been brought up, and I think certainly nowadays, this is much more the understanding that folks have of this situation than it was when I was a kid growing up. But as time has gone on, people have come to a much greater appreciation of this word covenant. That we have certainly the word commandments that comes up all the time, and we are about to read the first rendering of the Ten Commandments, and God Himself uses the word commandments in his speech here. But at the same time, we read this and understand that it's more than just laws and thou shalt do this, thou shalt do that. It becomes more of a covenant, and many refer to it in terms of a marriage covenant between God and Israel, and the tenderness in His feeling toward them, even as He speaks of Himself bearing them on eagle's wings, and in 19:4, I brought you to myself. There are personal and tender words being used. 19:5, you shall be my own possession among all the peoples, and things of this nature. Even God speaking of them, as we read in 19:6, of a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. And the word holy, the basis of this is set apart. So we have this set apartness, God calling these people to Himself in a covenantal relationship. And so this we will keep in mind as we go through chapter 20 and see the things that God said. And it may just sound a little different in your ear when thinking about this as more than just uh, a list of rules, a list of commandments, but rather a covenant that is kept. Now, the difference is that laws and covenants are often between, you might even say, adversarial parties, where, okay, we have to put certain things down on paper, but we will then hire a bunch of lawyers to figure out where the loopholes are and what we can do to get out of keeping one point or another, whereas a covenant is more a heart thing. This is just laying out in broad strokes what we are trying to do and accomplish, and we will do this because it is in our heart to do this. So we're not looking for ways to get out of it, we're looking for ways to get into it. Completely different mindset and feeling of motivation toward keeping a covenant versus keeping just a bunch of laws and commandments. So with that in mind, at chapter 20, the Lord spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God. This is the first identifier of who is making this covenant. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. Number 1, in verse 3, you shall have no other gods before me. Number 2, verse 4, you shall not make for yourself an idol or any likeness of what is in heaven above or on the earth beneath or in the water under the earth. You shall not worship them or serve them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children on the third and the fourth generations of those who hate me, but showing loving kindness to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments. Number 3, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not leave him unpunished who takes his name in vain. I'm just going to read them through and then we can talk about questions you may have about any of these. Number, where are we at? 1, 2, 3, 4. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male or your female servant, or your cattle, or your sojourner who stays with you. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore, the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Number 6. Number 5, sorry. Verse 12. Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be prolonged in the land which the Lord your God gives you. Number 6. You shall not murder. 7. You shall not commit adultery. 8. You shall not steal. 9. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. 10. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male servant, or his female servant, or his ox, or his donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. Okay, so that is probably a good place to pause and say, okay, now we have these 10 commandments, which I will make a statement that I've made before. Many of you will have heard this, but it is more so for the benefit of those who may be just new to the scripture, or may actually be using it to help to teach someone else. If we read this from the context of what we would expect of spouses, what we would expect of people who are in a marital relationship, something like the first commandment, you shall have no other gods before me, takes on a deeper meaning and significance, and also common sense. If you get married, it is understood and it is in your vows that you will keep yourself solely for the other. And that is in the depths of relationships that we can have, whether they be psychological, emotional, physical. We maintain the sanctity, purity, exclusivity, and priority of the relationship between that man and wife. And so God is speaking in this way. I don't have any other gods before me. That just makes sense. He is their God. He is the one who has set them apart to himself. And he doesn't want this to be a one-sided love affair. If I am giving myself completely to you and committing myself completely to you, then I want you also to commit yourself completely to me and not put anyone in my place. And so if he is God, then we should have no other God. Just as if I'm my wife's husband, she should have no other husband. That just makes sense. So the second one continues on. Don't make an idol. Don't worship anyone else but me. That's, again, makes sense if you are thinking, now, worship is a term that we don't apply in our interpersonal relationships, that we would worship someone else, although that word in its original etymology or breakdown, as some of you have discovered in reading definitions, is worthship. So you are treating someone as being of ultimate worth. And so some of the old wedding formulas that or vows that were used in the middle 15th, 16th, 17th century use terms like, with my body, I worship you. And that is just indicating that I see you as being of ultimate value and worth, and I'm going to treat you in that way. Again, not putting anyone or anything in that place of priority, not taking the name of the Lord in vain. And that word vain is often used in scripture to speak of worthlessness. If something is vain, it's of no value. So when we speak of the name of the Lord, and this is a bit of a situation that we should think of when we use the word name in our context. We usually think of it just as an identifier, but if you will read, and we will probably just touch on it a little later, but just to give you a little context, if you go forward into Exodus 33 and 18, you see an interaction again between Moses and God, where Moses says to God, "Show me your glory." This is Exodus 33, 18. And 19 says, God said, "I myself will make all my goodness pass before you and will proclaim the name of the Lord before you. And I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious, and will show compassion on whom I will show compassion." Then in chapter 34, verse 6, then Yahweh passed in front of him and proclaimed, "Yahweh, Yahweh Elohim, the Lord God." And so he proclaimed his name, and then went into a description of what this name signifies, stands for, and represents. The Lord God, Yahweh, Yahweh Elohim, these names that we came up against in Genesis chapter 2, as far back as Genesis chapter 2. Compassionate, gracious, slow to anger, abounding in loving kindness and truth, keeping loving kindness for thousands, who forgives iniquity, transgression, and sin, yet he will by no means leave the guilty unpunished, visiting the iniquity of fathers on the children and on the grandchildren to the third and fourth generations. Isn't that what we just read in chapter 20, verses 5 and 6? God repeating this and then speaking about his name, and his name is associated with all of these elements that we read in chapter 34. Love, compassion, graciousness, slow to anger, and a judge, a righteous judge who will not allow sin to go unpunished. So this is God's character being itemized in Exodus 34. And so when we read verse 7 in Exodus 20, taking the name of the Lord in vain really is saying all of this that we read about God and what he has to say about himself and for himself in chapter 34. It's vain, it's worthless, it's of no value. So that's taking the name of the Lord in vain, treating the Lord as if he is of no value, or his name, which represents all of his character and works, as we read in chapter 34, means nothing. So that is the explanation of taking his name in vain. The Sabbath day, of course, from I almost said from day one, but really from day 7, the Lord said, "Set this day apart. I'm giving this to you as a gift, and I want you to refresh yourself. I want you to rest. I want you to enjoy the fruit of your labors. I want you to take one day out of 7 for yourself for rest, and I'm making that a holy day, again, a set apart day." And it is important for us to this day not to violate the principle of the Sabbath. Take a day in 7 and and refresh yourself, rest. That is the initial thing. We talk about how people have used it in worship settings, and we'll talk about that another time. No issue at all, people having that set apart as their day of worship, but certainly from Genesis 2 and here in Exodus 20, it is set apart as a day of rest from labor. And then, so those uh, first 4 are very, very directly related to, or the first 3 related to God in Himself, in very particular toward our relationship to God and our thinking about God. The 4th one speaks about how we should take care of ourselves. And verse 12, honor your father and mother, speaks of the blessing that we receive when we give appropriate honor and worthship to our parents. And this comes with a blessing that we will have long life as we honor our parents. Then we get into the last 5, which deal with our relationships with, and could be with those close to us, but really much more with those we would say are outside of our immediate circle. Don't murder, don't commit adultery, don't steal, don't go to court and bear false witness against your neighbor, and don't covet what your neighbor has. So, anything on the 10 commandments that you would like to comment on or ask about?
Go ahead, Sister Elise.
Okay, I'm looking at verse 6 and a little bit verse 5. And I just have this thought in my head that I have no basis for. It's just a thought that when it said, you hear the phrase love is an action word. And
Yeah.
the thought in verse 6 is carried on into the New Testament quite a few times. If you love me, keep my commandments. And that's like a reflection of what is here. So it's as though, okay, so what is love? It's not, it may be a feeling, but scripturally it seems to be evidenced or carried out by the action of obedience. And then when I look back in verse 5, I'm wondering about the word hate and whether the way we look at that word in our modern day might also be a little different. This is what I have no basis for, is that I wonder if you could even just put disregard in there. Those who, just don't give me, and even when he says, Jacob have I loved, but Esau have I hated, it could almost be that, I honor Jacob, but I disregard Esau. And that was just a thought that sometimes the words they use, we might not get the context, but it seems that I don't know.
Yeah, I just can't get on my laptop right now. This is a good time to do the Bible Hub thing, and some of you may have other translations handy to you. Number one, a word like hate. In Hebrew writing, poetry, and all of that, they tend to go to extremes, try to make a point, sort of that's not quite as extreme, like the Jacob I have loved, Esau I have hated. God doesn't just decide I'm going to hate somebody, but that word is used to just speak of the sort of the extreme end of someone's thought process or action. Even the one that people often quote, train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. This sounds like an absolutist statement, which even for the one who wrote it, it was clear that I believe that's Solomon and Proverbs, or is that David? No, somehow I think it's Proverbs. Someone can remind me. I don't have that just at the tip
Yeah,
of
it's
my
Proverbs.
fingertips.
That's a proverb.
Yeah. So the point being, there are tendencies, and so if you train your child correctly, it will tend to do what's right. Hatred is a word that's used for those who tend to disregard and see God as worthless. So it is. I presume many of the translations would use that strong word hate, but the way it's used contextually is usually speaking of one, as you say, who disregards, discounts, does not expend any energy to express appreciation, love, and gratefulness to God, which leads them more in the tendency of one who hates another. So yeah. Anyone else, Brother James?
Nope.
Okay. Now, I should
Sorry, I think you missed me, brother James. If my hand was up and was technical problems.
Oh,
With
sorry.
regard to the Sabbath, Pastor, which is I've been mulling it over for the last couple weeks. Just as you said, with the 400 and 430 days as sort of a place where people like to take some shots or try to disenfranchise, if that's the right word, the biblical knowledge and so on. But it seems apparent to me that there's a good possibility that as it was presented to the Israelites in this day, and right around the time that the Pharisees were accusing Jesus Christ, that already in that point of span of time, some of the meaning of the Sabbath as delivered by Moses here may have in fact changed. Would you think that it would be consistent from day to day, or do you think there's a shifting application of this part of the covenant?
Yeah, so there is a thought process that God laid out various laws. I guess the accepted number is 613 laws that he laid out for Israel. And as time went on, there were questions that came up, arose about the interpretation and application of these laws. So being a covenant, we come to the understanding that we are not talking about something that is to be parsed and broken down and abided by in the minutest detail. It's speaking about what God is trying to accomplish in us and for us. So I may have mentioned last week that for example, priests, once we get into the whole tabernacle worship system, priests actually worked twice as hard on the Sabbath as they did on other days, in that the quota of sacrifices that they were to offer were doubled on the Sabbath day versus any other day. So we read all the way up into the book of Luke when we read about Zechariah, the priest, John the Baptist's father. They had a roster, a rotation of priests. So yes, there might be a priest working on a particular day, doing double duty. So again, you start to think, okay, so if he is working twice as hard on the Sabbath day, no doubt he would have a day other than the Sabbath as his day of rest. The principle is, whether it be animals, servants, individuals, even the land, 1 in 7 is given to rest. And so even as a priest, the one who represents God and does righteous acts, the Sabbath was the day he worked the hardest. So you would think by applying the principle of rest that he would then take another day as his Sabbath day and use that as his day of rest. Now, some things did change. For instance, speaking about manna, and again, we touched this when we came to the book of Deuteronomy. Manna would fall 6 days, and on the 6th day, you would pick up twice as much, so you'd have something for the 7th day. And so that was a very strict application of the Sabbath rule in this time of Israel going between Egypt and Canaan. Well, they got to Canaan, and of course, the manna stopped, and like that sort of force play of you can't even go out and get food. God was trying to teach them the principle by withholding food on the 7th day, giving them enough on the 6th day to take them through. But guess what? They had to apply that principle now once they got to Canaan, and it was no longer a force play. They had food available anytime, 7 days a week, but their responsibility was to continue to obey that law and obey that principle and not work 7 days a week. So yes, there's a letter of the law, and then there's a spirit of the law. And when it comes right down to it, as we find in the New Testament, the spirit of the law is what God is really after us obeying.
So what do you say then when you see the priests, in this case the Pharisees, versus the priest Jesus Christ, which was, they're both priests. I mean, and so it's kind of like me saying, well, I keep a better Sabbath than you, Pastor. It seems pretty not within the spirit that it was intended.
Yeah, so I think if we look at just about anything with an eye toward what is the law trying to accomplish, then it's fairly easy for us to understand the principle and application. So for some of our friends who are Seventh-day Adventists, they worship on the 7th day, not just resting, but worshiping. But there were people like my own aunt who was a nurse. Well, what do you tell your patients? Sorry, it's a Sabbath day. You've just come in on a gurney from an accident and can't touch you till tomorrow. So too bad, so sad, you die. So they quickly came to the understanding doing good, doing righteous acts is totally permissible on the Sabbath day. So you go back to the principle, we will rest 1 in 7, even though it may not be that particular day.
Praise the Lord Jesus.
Amen. All right. So now we will just finish off the chapter from verse 18. The people, this is Exodus 20, verse 18. All the people perceived the thunder and the lightning flashes and the sound of the trumpet and the mountains smoking. When the people saw it, they trembled and stood at a distance. Let me stop there. There's one point again, for those who may not have gone through this before. I really should have given you one other piece of information with regard to the second law, second commandment, and our way of understanding it. Verse 5, and Sister Elise mentioned it, and I had meant to say it then and didn't. You shall not worship them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children, on the third and the fourth generations of those who hate me, but showing loving kindness to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments. So as she was mentioning this love-hate thing, which is very extreme. And again, there are those who would look at this and say, God is jealous, he is vindictive, he is hateful, he is spiteful. Why would he punish people who have not sinned to the third and fourth generation of those who hate him? And so as we read, Exodus 34 repeats this particular situation in talking about God and his character, but I would just ask you to read Ezekiel 18, where God gives Ezekiel a very detailed explanation of how this actually works in practice. The things that I do as an individual absolutely affect my children and would be, they would even participate in judgment or punishment that God gives to me. So if I live a sinful life, if I live a wasteful life, if I take all the money I make and go and drink it all away or gamble it all away, my children are going to suffer, not because of the direct hand of God against them, but because they are connected to me. They are punished because of my actions. I'm actually the one punishing them, but they are receiving negative outcomes because of what I have done. In some cases, you will see children also following in the footsteps of their parents. That's the example that they've had. And they are punished for the sins that they do as their parents did. But I think probably at some point the Lord thought, you know what, let me just give them a very full accounting of how this works. So please read Ezekiel 18, and that will give you a very clear understanding of how God judges each person individually. And this cycle of generational blessings or judgment can easily be broken by any individual who does what is right in the sight of the Lord and cuts the many of the any of the things that God would have been doing in overt judgment against an individual would not pass on to their children. Although, as I mentioned, there are things parents do that absolutely affect their children in a very negative way if they are doing wrong, and things that parents do that can very positively affect their children. But one of the things that I note in reading this is you talk about negatives being restricted to the children of perpetrators to the third and the fourth generation. But the loving kindness part in 20 verse 6 extends to thousands of commandments. So I don't know how many generations thousands would represent, but in most cases, it would be a whole lot more than 3 or 4. And again, there are times that we read these things and we should read them in the context that God will judge and there will be negative outcomes to those close to perpetrators of or sinners. And for those who are associated with the righteous, there is an abundance of blessings. That's kind of the way we look at it, the terminology we would use in our times. And we are not intended to take these things to say, okay, 4 generations, done. Thousands, again, is a word that is sort of open-ended, but we are to understand it along the lines of little or much, as it was with Abraham, where God said, your descendants will be like the stars of the heaven or like the sands of the sea. Well, you wouldn't have to pick up too many shovelfuls of sand to realize that there are way more grains of sand on the seashore than Israel could ever have in its population, way more stars in the heaven than Israel could ever have in their population. It's not a matter of being tied down to those specifics. It's to understand the poetic scope that you will have many descendants. It's not to be tied down to negative impacts on 3 or 4 generations. It's and blessings to thousands. It's to say God in his mercy will restrict the negativity of what I have done on succeeding generations, and he will multiply the benefits of his blessing to the offspring of those who love him, serve him, worship him, etc. So that's the kind of context to read it in, many or few, not to be tied down to the specifics of the language being used here. I hope that might clarify for someone. But if you'd like to know in greater detail about God's judgment, please read Ezekiel 18.
Elise did have her hand up.
Okay.
It's fun. I was really about to talk about the same thing, but with just the addition that it doesn't even really say that I've always read it that the children to the the iniquity of the fathers, and assuming that the children were doing well. It doesn't really say that. It could be that the 3rd and 4th generation of children are also not doing what they should do, and it just occurred to me though that the grace of God, and then Pastor said, it restricts the judgment to the 3rd and 4th generation, but shows his loving devotion to 1,000 generations.
And so, yeah, again, it's just understanding, and very clearly, it couldn't, if you read it, it could be talking about fathers and sinful generations of children who come from him, and also on the negative impacts of what he has done on future generations. But the point of the whole that whole speech is, I will restrict my judgment on those who do bad, but I will be very multitudinous in my blessings on those who do well. Okay, so I read verse 18 about the people, perceiving the thunder and lightning and all of that. Verse 19, then they said to Moses, speak to us yourself and we will listen. but let not God speak to us, or we will die. Moses said to the people, do not be afraid, for God has come in order to test you, and in order that the fear of him may remain with you, so that you may not sin. And people stood at a distance and were shaking in their boots. Now, verse 22, the Lord said to Moses, thus you shall say to the sons of Israel, you yourselves have seen that I have spoken to you from heaven. Then he repeats the first commandment, you shall not make other gods besides me. Sort of a combination actually of the first and second. Gods of silver or gods of gold, you shall not make for yourselves. And so he has given them his commandments here in chapter 20. The people said, Moses, from now on, please tell God not to talk to us anymore. We don't like his conversation. And God said, hey, Moses, just remind them, I've spoken to them so that this should reverberate in their minds. And as I read to you from Deuteronomy, it certainly reverberated in Moses' mind, so that 15 times he reminded them of the fact that God spoke to them with an audible voice. Very impressive. And the people heard, and certainly had every reason to continue to now live in the reality that God, the Almighty, spoke to them, told them how he wanted them to live. And of course, we take that today to say God has spoken to us very clearly through his word, and we also need to live in that reality. All right.
Deanne also had her hand up.
Go ahead, Sister Deanne.
I also put it down, Brother James. I was just trying to find, I think it's 20 or 21. The version I was listening to today talked about the fact that God decided to speak to him so that when they heard his voice, or after hearing his voice, the fear of what they heard or their reaction to hearing him would cause them not to sin. And so hence the reason I put my hand down, because I was trying to find that again. So it's I don't know if it's here or.
Well, 19:9 is probably one that you're thinking of. So that's 19 and 9. And then at what he said in verse 20 is intended, in our 2020 is the one I think in particular that you are thinking of. The fear of him may remain in you so that you may not sin. So, yeah.
Yes, that's exactly the one.
Yeah.
I found that very interesting, but then they asked not to hear his voice again, right? But clearly the hearing the voice did not cause the fear to linger too long, because we see later on that they started sinning again quite quickly. So
Well, actually, that's a point that comes up, something we do need to remember. If we don't get this in our heart, and if we don't relate to God out of love, fear is a temporary emotion. Fear does not cause really long-term change. Even in a war situation, there's great fear, and then guess what? There are some people who say, no, we're going to fight. Resistance fighters arise, and they do whatever they can, even at the cost of their own lives. They overcome that fear and go on to resist. But the greatest motivating force in the universe is love, and love supersedes fear by multiples, in its effectiveness and its ability to guide our actions long term. And that's certainly demonstrated in God's relationship to humanity. His love drives him and has driven him for all of time in creating everything he has for the benefit of his people. And so Israel just seemed to have a whole lot of trouble coming to this place of loving God. And to this day, that is a situation that negatively impacts God's people. There are religious people who do what's right because of rules and regs. God is actually looking for love. That's the greatest motivator that we could ever have to serve him acceptably and not sin. Why? Because we don't want to do something that would displease him and make him unhappy. Not just, okay, I can do this because I found a loophole to get around what he is saying. So love is absolutely that motivating factor. But in this case, as we have in other cases, you think of God using things that strike fear in the heart of people. And fear does have a very strong short-term impact in causing people to do what the other person wants, who is instilling the fear in them. Parents may use some of these techniques with children, even with slapping their hand if they're going to touch something hot or whatever. It hurts. The child doesn't want that. That is a very negative response. But a parent isn't going to be spanking their child when they're 28 years old. You've got to get past that stage pretty quickly. Jonah went to Nineveh. If you don't turn to God immediately, basically fire and brimstone is coming down on you. Fear gripped the people. They repented, and fasting and prayer, sackcloth and ashes, all of that. Well, it wasn't permanent. It was temporary. It stayed the hand of God. But later on in history, Nineveh went back to being Nineveh and were destroyed. So fear has a place short term, but it is not the motivating factor to long-term transformation, whereas love is.
Go ahead, Elise.
All right. And I guess it just brings back to mind again the fact that, love does encompass obedience. So, but when we're reading verse 20, can you parse that out a little bit? This is a Berean Study Bible version, and it says, "Do not be afraid," Moses replied, "for God has come to test you so that the fear of him may be before you." So,
Yeah. So
He's in.
again, we come to points of interpretation. That word fear is used in a couple of main ways in Scripture. Respect and reverence being one, and being scared being the other. And so again, it's one word, and that we see used here, but we try to read in context to say, okay, what do we think it's really talking about here? God has come to test you. Well, what does this test involve? Right now, they've heard the voice of God. It has made them fearful, but I would say that the test is really whether this voice and this experience would cause them long term to have that reverence for God, that honor for God, that would cause them not to sin. So I think even in this verse, now again, I I am imagining, because I can't just check it quickly, someone may be able to do so. You have the word "do not be afraid," and I am presuming, without having the ability to check it now, that that's a different Hebrew word than the word used for fear later on in the verse. So if someone
It's,
wants to jump onto Bible Hub and see if my presumption is correct, it seems that even in the translation I have here, it's trying to show the two kinds of fear, one being afraid and one being respectful and reverent.
it's, I think it's a bit related, but but it is a different word.
Anyway, I would have to double check that and get to the root words being used. I wish I could do that right now, but
So when I look, if you're interested, I think the root word here for the one in Exodus 20:20 is Yahweh. And they're saying it's a primitive word meaning to fear, but to morally revere as well. And so they're using, so it's both the reverence piece that's listed here in the definition and the idea of being frightened is also
So
this word.
I was just wondering if the first part of the verse where it says "do not be afraid," what that word is for afraid, and then as it continues on, in order that the fear of him may remain in you.
The second
the
one
same?
is yira, a fear, and it's from Yahweh.
If you are able to, for instance, in the Strong's, if you have those words listed with Strong's concordance numbers, if it's the same number, then you'd
No,
say,
one
okay,
is 3372 and one is 3374.
okay, so
But it's
so
like I said, they're related. One comes from
yeah,
the other. Yeah.
okay, so same, probably same root, but different application. And again, the difference of application between fear as in being scared and fear as in reverence. So both of those aspects of the word fear are listed in this verse. So the test is, will you revere God and keep from sin as we go forward? Now, I will just mention chapter 21. There isn't a whole lot that I want to really talk about there, but again, just from the standpoint of being able to get to where I'd like to start next week, I'm going to give you chapter 21 and 22 to sort of read through on your own. There is just there are a couple of things I will mention quickly in passing. In chapter 21 and verse 2, if you buy a Hebrew slave, he shall serve for 6 years, but on the seventh he shall go out as a free man without payment. And so you see, certainly slavery was very much a part of the social fabric and the economic fabric of the times, and God was instituting something that with my people, and again, we need to read this from the standpoint that God wasn't trying to make revolutionary changes in society. It's more like evolutionary changes that take place over a longer period of time, but are leading toward where he wants to go. They were slaves in Egypt for 400, or oppressed. We talked about that last week, how much time actually the slavery portion in Egypt was, which was likely 200 and something years. but that's a lot different from 6 years. So God is saying, if this situation happens, and this is referred to a number of other times throughout the law, when you speak about Hebrew selling himself as a slave to make payments for his land or whatever the case may be, there would come this time, if it's a Hebrew, 6 years, the 7th year he goes free. There are times that people would make would take out loans or mortgages against their land. And then on the 50th year, the Jubilee year, all those debts would be canceled. There were things that were being instituted for the benefit of the Hebrews and even how they treated each other. And even as Pastor Adrian was preaching yesterday, those who have received grace extend grace. And so they had received so much from God. He was giving them ways in which they would extend that grace to others. Verse 5, 21:5 talks about slaves who would decide that, no, they are going to stay with their master, even when the time comes that they could be freed because they love their master, they would choose to stay. And it talks about how you would deal with a slave like that. And that particular terminology that we now might use, so you've heard the term bond slave, someone who has determined they will remain a slave to their master because of love. And this was a term that the disciples in the New Testament routinely used for themselves in reference to their service to Christ. So this is where that concept comes from. And the other thing I would mention in chapter 21 is in verse 32, 21:32. If the ox gores a male or female slave, the owner shall give his or her master 30 shekels of silver, and the ox shall be stoned. Talking about wounding by animals or by other people. And so here is the first mention of something that goes all the way again up to Judas's betrayal of Christ, that 30 shekels of silver was established as the price you would pay for a slave that had been gored and killed by an animal. And so when Jesus was sold for 30 pieces of silver, he was sold for the price of a slave. And that's another one of those things that sort of hits you right in the gut when you see the disdain that they had for Jesus. Chapter 22 goes on to talk about further property rights, including a little piece in 22:16. And again, please read this through in detail on your own. But 22:16, if a man seduces a virgin who is not engaged and lies with her, he must pay a dowry for her to be his wife. And again, this was totally foreign to what was common in those days, that men would do what men do, or power imbalances where they would seduce or rape women, and then they would be left to fend for themselves. God said, no. And again, don't read this with modern eyes to say, how does this fit with modern sensibilities or sensitivities? Let's read it in the context of a society that was male dominated. Men did whatever they want. Women were not counted as anything, no rights. But God said, look, if a guy goes out and does this, seduces a girl and has his way with her, he can't just throw her aside and now, she has to deal with the shame. Certainly, if people knew about what happened, it would absolutely reduce her ability to be married and have her own family. That's the way it was. And God said, nope, nope. If a man is going to do that, he has to take her as his wife. And that was one monstrous step forward in in making sure that women weren't just treated as nothing and abused and left to fend for themselves. So again, don't read that and think, well, how does that fit with our laws and rules or culture today? I'm just making the point to say that there was evolution. There were steps being taken toward a better future, and certainly in this case, as far as women were concerned, concern for women who had been abused, sexually abused by men, which was very different from what they typically did. And then verse 29, again, a reminder of what they had come to understand from the Passover. You shall, this is 22:29, you shall not delay the offering from your harvest and your vintage. In other words, the tithe that you are to bring to the temple must be brought on time. And the firstborn of your sons you shall give to me. So again, the reminder that when I give you that firstborn son, of course, they should be redeemed. In other words, the fee paid for their redemption, they weren't to be killed, but it was a constant reminder that the firstborn, the first fruit, belongs to God. And so those are just a couple of things I would touch on in chapter 22. And yeah, I think I'll stop there. We'll pick up at 23 next time. 23 is also a fairly short chapter with just a couple of points there, but I think we will just end at 22 and pick up at 23 next time. So we just have a few minutes. If there is a question, a comment, anything on your mind, this is the last call.
I'm kind of stuck on the fear piece that you mentioned. One thing I've always said is that fear is the greatest motivating factor, but I think you explained it so well that fear will bring change, but it's really only temporary. And it really explains why the enemy tries to use fear, because if he makes you afraid and you do something you shouldn't, then that opens the door for guilt and shame and all these other emotions to come in. And I've never thought of it the way you presented it, but that's a very interesting way to look at it, that really love is the greatest motivating factor, because, and the Bible tells us that perfect love casts out fear. And that's why we see that the enemy uses fear, because it helps him get in. And yeah, I mean, the way you presented it was amazing.
Yeah, oh, thank God. Yeah, and that verse you quoted, perfect love casts out fear, because fear has torment, so you could do something horrible to someone. Well, what is it that will overcome the ensuing guilt and shame? It is the victim coming to you with love and opening the door to reconciliation through love. Now, they can't open that door and will not open that door through judgment, retribution, revenge, and all of those other things. The door is opened by love, which of course is precisely the door that is opened to us to approach Jesus Christ. It is his love that is shed abroad. It is his love, certainly, that motivated him to save us. So and of course, God is love. That is more than just a characteristic. It is his essence. When you use that "I am" kind of terminology of the existential reality of God, it's love. And so that's another reason why I say love is the greatest um, power in the universe, because God is love. All right. Well, folks, that will do it for today. And as I mentioned earlier, next week, Pastor Adrian will graciously take us forward from where we are. And yeah, we will enjoy that. I unfortunately will be away. I shouldn't say unfortunately, I will be away. And yes, it is Thanksgiving Monday, and I did discuss that with Pastor Adrian, and he very much would like to continue with our study. In part, there are those who are along for the ride, who are in different countries and different situations where holidays are different. Even for some of our American friends, their Thanksgiving is in November versus October, and so he has, I will say, insisted that we will continue even though it's a public holiday. So for those who are able to join us next week, we'll be here right on time, and we'll carry on under his leadership next Monday night. And so I will see you in 2 weeks, and God be with you all in Jesus' name.
Be fearless and ask a question.